The relationship between the United States and Canada has long been a textbook example of international cooperation. It is built on shared values, a common language, the world's longest undefended border. More than that, it is built on trade. Billions of dollars in goods and services cross this border every single day. This creates a deeply intertwined economic reality for both nations. Auto parts made in Ontario, cars assembled in Michigan, lumber from British Columbia, homes in California. The connection is seamless, a partnership taken for granted for generations. But what happens when that foundation is suddenly shaken? Imagine a near-future fracture. On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in early 2026, the White House announces a sweeping immediate ban. The ban targets a wide range of key Canadian goods. The stated reasons: protecting American jobs and national security. The news sends a shockwave through Ottawa's halls of power, and across every sector of the Canadian economy. This is not a minor trade dispute. This is a full-scale economic blockade by Canada's closest ally, the unthinkable. The crisis begins at 9 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time. The White House press secretary steps up to the podium for a special announcement. The news is delivered bluntly. Effective immediately, a presidential executive order imposes a complete ban on the import of specific Canadian goods. The list is long. Softwood lumber, raw aluminum, processed beef, canola oil. The justification cited is a threat to American industries and a need to secure domestic supply chains. The message is broadcast live across North America. Trading rooms in Toronto react, corporate offices in Calgary react. There is a moment of stunned silence followed by frantic activity. The Canadian dollar, the loonie, begins to plummet. By noon, the effects are already being felt at the border. Trucks carrying lumber from Quebec are turned away at the crossing into Vermont. A shipment of Alberta beef is denied entry at the border crossing in Montana. The electronic systems that process customs declarations begin flashing red with rejections. Trucking companies suddenly have drivers and multi-million-dollar cargoes stranded with nowhere to go. The initial financial damage is measured not in days but in hours as contracts are breached and perishable goods begin to spoil. To understand this drastic action, we must look at the political climate in the United States that led to it. The ban was not a random act. It was the culmination of a political movement built on an America First ideology. The administration in Washington had campaigned on a promise to protect American workers from what it called unfair foreign competition. For years, politicians had pointed to shuttered factories and the Rust Belt job losses in manufacturing. They argued that trade agreements, even with allies like Canada, had hollowed out the American middle class. This message resonated deeply with millions of voters who felt left behind by globalization. The specific justifications for the ban on Canadian goods were framed in the language of national security and economic fairness. Softwood lumber. The U.S. accused Canadian provinces of subsidizing timber. That, they said, let Canadian companies sell lumber in the U.S. at unbeatable prices. The ban was pitched as leveling the playing field to revive American mills. Steel. The administration invoked a rarely used national security clause. Aluminum. The same clause was cited. They claimed over-reliance on foreign metals risked the nation's ability to build military hardware and critical infrastructure. Beef. Agricultural bans were framed differently. Canola oil, also targeted under regulatory concerns. They claimed Canadian food safety rules weren't as stringent, risking American consumers. Ultimately, the decision was a calculated political move. The focus remained short-term political gains and the symbolism of putting America first. The immediate victims were the industries directly targeted. In the small towns of British Columbia and Quebec, the forestry sector is not just an industry, it is a way of life. Within the first week of the ban, the impact was devastating. With their primary export market suddenly gone, sawmills had no choice but to drastically curtail production. A mill that once processed thousands of logs a day fell silent. The impact on employment was swift and brutal. Interfor announced massive layoffs. Resolute Forest Products announced massive layoffs. In a town of 5,000 people where the mill employs 500, this is an economic apocalypse. An estimated 20,000 direct jobs in the lumber industry vanished within the first month. The pain was just as acute in the metals sector. The aluminum smelters in Quebec, which rely on clean hydroelectric power, produce some of the world's lowest carbon aluminum. Much of it was destined for American auto plants. The ban brought this trade to a screeching halt. Rio Tinto scaled back operations. Alcoa scaled back operations. On the prairies, the agricultural sector was thrown into chaos. Alberta is famous for its high-quality beef. The ban meant ranchers had a massive surplus of cattle with no market to sell to. The price of Canadian beef plummeted. For Canadian shoppers, the initial impact was less direct but still noticeable. The Canadian dollar had weakened significantly, making all imported goods more expensive. A trade ban is like a large rock thrown into a pond. The initial splash is dramatic, but the ripples spread far and wide, touching every corner of the water. The first ripple beyond the directly affected industries was felt in transportation and logistics. The trucking industry, the backbone of U.S. Canada trade, was hit hard. Thousands of drivers who specialized in cross-border routes were suddenly idle. Trucking companies saw their revenues evaporate overnight. One company with 100 trucks might now only have 20 on the road. Widespread layoffs followed, drivers, dispatchers, mechanics. The dominoes continued to fall. The next ripple hit manufacturing, especially the auto industry. Finished cars weren't banned, but supply chains were. Parts crossed the border multiple times. A transmission made in Canada shipped to Ohio included in an engine shipped back to Ontario. The aluminum ban created chaos. A Canadian parts maker couldn't ship key components to the U.S. assembly lines, slowed, or stopped. The financial sector felt the tremors. Corporate loan defaults began to rise. Finally, the ripple hit housing. The single act of a trade ban had infected every part of the Canadian economy. The economic statistics of a recession, GDP contraction, unemployment rates, currency devaluation can feel, well, pretty abstract. But on Main Street, in communities across Canada, the impact was deeply personal and painfully real. The initial wave of layoffs in lumber, metals, agriculture was just the beginning. The second wave hit local businesses. The local diner in a mill town used to be packed at lunch but was now mostly empty. The owner had to lay off 2 waitresses and a cook. The local hardware store saw its sales cut in half. Gas stations, car dealerships, grocery stores for Canadian families. The crisis showed up as a painful squeeze on household budgets. The Canadian dollar had fallen to a record low, trading at just 60 cents against the U.S. dollar. This meant that the price of anything imported or anything with imported components skyrocketed. A family's weekly grocery bill jumped by an estimated 25%. A bunch of bananas from Central America went from $1.50 to $2.50. A box of cereal from a U.S. brand went from $5 to $7. The cost of gasoline, which is priced in U.S. dollars on the global market, also surged, even as the global price of oil remained stable. It now cost $100 to fill up the family minivan, up from $75 just a few weeks prior. The psychological toll was immense. The stress was palpable in homes across the country, as families grappled with financial strain and an uncertain future. The Canadian government's reaction was a frantic mix of diplomacy, legal action, and domestic support. In the initial days, the focus was on de-escalation. The Prime Minister and key cabinet ministers worked the phones, calling their counterparts in Washington. They sought to understand the full scope of the ban and to appeal for a reversal based on the long history of partnership. They stressed the integrated nature of the two economies, arguing the ban would harm American businesses and consumers. These early diplomatic efforts were met with a firm, unyielding response from the White House. The message was clear: the ban was not negotiable. With diplomacy failing, Ottawa pivoted to a multi-pronged strategy. The first prong was legal. Canada immediately launched a challenge at the World Trade Organization. Simultaneously, it prepared a challenge under CUSMA. Lawyers and trade experts began compiling mountains of evidence. But legal battles take years to play out, offering no immediate relief to the collapsing economy. The second prong was retaliatory. After a week of deliberation, Canada announced retaliatory tariffs. The list was curated to inflict political pain: Kentucky bourbon, Wisconsin cheese, Florida oranges. The aftermath of this hypothetical trade war would leave deep and lasting scars on the U.S.-Canada relationship. Even if the ban were eventually lifted after a change in administration or a negotiated settlement, the trust that had been the bedrock of the partnership for over a century would be shattered. Canada would have learned a painful lesson about the risks of being overly dependent on a single trading partner, no matter how friendly. The crisis would force a fundamental rethinking of Canadian economic and foreign policy. The top priority would become diversification. The government would launch an aggressive multi-decade effort to forge new trade deals and strengthen ties with other markets. European Union, Asia-Pacific economies. This diversification would not be easy or quick. Building new trade relationships takes years of negotiation and investment. Canadian businesses would need to adapt their products and supply chains for new markets with different regulations and consumer preferences. The government would need to invest heavily in infrastructure such as ports on the Pacific coast to facilitate trade with Asia. There would be a national push to add more value to raw materials at home rather than exporting them for processing elsewhere. For example, instead of just exporting raw lumber, the focus would shift to manufacturing finished wood products like furniture and mass timber components in Canada. This would be a long and expensive transformation. Ultimately, the crisis would redefine the meaning of the world's longest undefended border. While it would likely remain physically undefended, it would become a much harder economic and psychological boundary. The story serves as a cautionary tale that even the strongest friendships can be broken, and that the economic prosperity built on generations of trust can be undone with shocking speed.